topping our headlines on this Tuesday afternoon. Local COVID-19 infections have rebounded amid the absence of the weekend factor, as authorities are poised to share their plan for second booster doses this week. Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky has made a poignant appeal for defense support from South Korea as his forces brace for a major Russian offensive in the eastern part of the country. A nuclear-powered US aircraft carrier will be entering the East Sea later this week in an apparent display of military force amid rampant speculation about additional acts of provocation by North Korea. Hello and welcome. You're watching the Daily Report for Tuesday, April 12th here in Korea. I'm Min San-hee. There has been a rebound in COVID-19 infections here on the local front on this Tuesday, but officials point out the tally, nonetheless, is in line with recent declines on a weekly basis. Our Kim Sung-min has this top story.
The number of new COVID-19 cases in South Korea on Tuesday climbed back above the 200,000 mark. The country reported around 210,000 cases, almost double the previous day's relatively low tally, following fewer tests done over the weekend. This figure, however, is the lowest for a Tuesday for 5 weeks and keeps the nation's weekly average in the 203,000 range. The average weekly figure has been trending downward since March 17th, when it hit 405,000. Also, the number of deaths from COVID-19 in the country was the lowest in almost a month, with 171. Meanwhile, the first case of the Omicron hybrid variant, dubbed XL, has been identified in the country. The person reportedly had a booster shot but tested positive on the 23rd last month, but showed no symptoms. This comes as the nation's health authorities are planning to further dial back social distancing rules as the virus is expected to become endemic. That move will run parallel with efforts to reinforce protection for more vulnerable people. On Wednesday, South Korean health authorities are set to announce plans for a fourth round of vaccinations, which will focus on high-risk groups. While fourth shots are already being administered, the country is aiming to expand the program to include more senior citizens and better protect them. People aged 60 or older now account for around 20% of the new cases and 95% of deaths from COVID-19. Kim Sung-min, Arirang News.
Staying with pandemic-related news, neighboring Japan has reported its first case of the XE variant, raising concerns about a regional spread in the near future. Our Incheon reports.
Japan has confirmed its first case of the Omicron XE derivative strain of the COVID-19 virus. On Monday, the Japanese Health Ministry reported the case of the XE variant in a woman who arrived at Narita Airport from the United States on March 26th. It's been reported that the woman, who's in her 30s, had received 2 shots of the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine. She showed no symptoms at the time of her departure from the United States and even upon her arrival at the airport in Japan. According to the UK Health Security Agency, the XE variant was first detected in the UK on January 19th, and since then, more than 600 cases of XE have been identified in the country. Research so far shows that the XE strain is a recombinant of Omicron's BA1 and BA2 subvariants. The agency explained that recombinant variants occur when an individual becomes infected with 2 or more variants at the same time, resulting in a mixture of their genetic material within the patient's body. According to the World Health Organization, preliminary data on the new COVID-19 variant XE shows it to be roughly 10% more transmissible than the BA2 subvariant of Omicron, which was thought to be the most infectious strain so far. Until significant distinctive features in severity or transmission are discovered, though, the WHO will classify the variant under the Omicron umbrella. Cases of this latest variant are slowly starting to occur around the world in countries like India and Thailand, and now Japan. While there may not yet be enough information to tell whether the XE will spread more rapidly or cause more serious illness than other variants, health authorities warn that people should not disregard safety precautions against COVID-19 just yet. Incheon, Arirang News.
In other news, US President Joe Biden may visit South Korea in late May for talks with President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol on the sidelines of his trip to Japan for the Quad Summit. Now, this speculation follows his talks with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Monday, during which Mr. Biden spoke of meeting Mr. Modi in Japan on, quote, about the 24th of May. Pundits here say if a summit between Mr. Biden and President-elect Yoon does take place in late May, it will be the earliest meeting between a South Korean leader and his US counterpart here in the country. Now, the two sides had reportedly spoken about an early summit, and this is according to Mr. Yoon's delegation to the US that recently returned home. A US nuclear-powered aircraft carrier has entered waters near South Korea in an apparent display of force to deter possible North Korean provocations in the days ahead. Our Peunji has more.
The U.S. Navy's Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group is in the East Sea in response to signs of North Korea resuming nuclear tests. According to sources, it is currently in international waters east of South Korea's Ulsan city. The U.S. Naval Institute also said Monday local time that the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group had entered waters between South Korea and Japan. It said that after a resumption of missile tests by North Korea following a pause of several years, ICBM and nuclear tests are anticipated in the near term. This is the first time in more than 4 years that the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Group has entered the East Sea, after a previous deployment there in November 2017. The U.S. Navy ship will reportedly stay in the East Sea for 5 days. When asked about the matter, the Defense Ministry did not give further details, but did confirm that it is currently in the international waters near the country.
It is in the international waters in the East Sea, but this is a U.S. strategic asset, so I don't think it would be appropriate for us to mention further details about this.
On Tuesday, South Korea and the U.S. kicked off crisis management staff training, a preliminary exercise ahead of a full-scale joint military drill. The exercise will last for 4 days until Friday. The two countries will likely hold the main drill or computer-simulated combined command post training next week from April 18th to 28th. 배은지, Arirang News.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has made a poignant appeal for tangible defense support from South Korea. Addressing members of the National Assembly on Monday, Mr. Zelensky sought to draw similarities between Seoul's own experience with bloodshed in the 1950s and Kyiv's current plight. Our Kim Do-yeon has more.
Appearing at South Korea's National Assembly via video link on Monday afternoon was Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky delivering an emotional speech, even making his interpreter too emotional to continue.
여러분께서 우리를 도와주시고 지원해 주시기를 요청합니다. 감사합니다.
In this message, apart from the horrific scenes of war that he described and showed through footage, what he and Ukrainians wanted to request from South Korea was clear.
South Korea can help Ukraine. Many military items that could help us defend against Russian tanks, missiles, or ships are in South Korea. Please help us fight against the Russians. If we get these weapons, not only does it protect Ukrainians, but it also helps the country itself as well as other countries who may be attacked by Russia too.
He added in appealing his message that in the 1950s, South Koreans endured a war as well, and the international community jumped in to help. This message also came just hours after the Defense Ministry said Minister Seoul rejected Ukraine's request last week for air defense weapon systems, saying there are limits to providing lethal weapons to Ukraine given South Korea's security situation and the potential impact on the readiness posture of the nation's military. So this isn't the first time Ukraine called for help this way. Last month, Seoul sent $10 million in humanitarian assistance and non-lethal items such as bulletproof vests and medical supplies. But it was widely expected for Zelensky to directly call on South Korean lawmakers through the speech for weapons aid. Lawmakers have differing opinions.
I wish to focus on humanitarian aid. It's painful times for them. People have been separated from their families and food is scarce. And also, I would like to focus on the rebuilding of their country after the war. This is because we have many Koreans in Russia and we have our companies active in Russia.
Now, recent days, all of free world decided to send a military aid to Ukrainian government. For instance, European Union has decided to send more military equipment in order to defend the Ukrainian civilians. So I think the military aid to Ukrainian government must be regarded as a kind of aid to protect the civilians.
As for the speech, it was broadcast live, and he now has spoken to 23 national legislatures, including those of the US, Canada, and Japan, seeking to coordinate international support for Ukraine. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Ukraine, meanwhile, is bracing itself for a major assault in the eastern part of the country as its Western allies pledge more support for Kyiv and sanctions on Kremlin. Our Kim Yo-san reports.
Ukraine says it expects Russia to launch a massive strike targeting the eastern part of the country, with the Kremlin raiding tens of thousands of troops there. Ukraine's defense ministry explained Monday that it forecasts active combat will begin in the Donbas region soon. Within the Donbas region, Russia aims to capture the city of Mariupol, Ukraine's main eastern port, where thousands of people are believed to have died since the start of Moscow's military operation in Ukraine. Against his backdrop, a pro-Russian rebel leader said Monday that separatist forces around Donetsk have successfully taken control of the port of Mariupol. He then explained that they would intensify fighting in eastern Ukraine. Meanwhile, Austria's leader sat down with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow on Monday, but gave a grim account of their conversation.
I generally have no optimistic impression that I can report to you from this conversation with President Putin. The offensive is evidently being prepared on a massive scale, which is why I made very clear that stable access for the International Red Cross is needed.
He then stressed that sanctions on Moscow will continue, which would mean long-lasting damage for Russia. The Biden administration is seeking to hold Putin and others in its military chain of command accountable for the war, with calls to assist an investigation by the International Criminal Court in The Hague into atrocities. However, laws limit Washington's ability to provide support for any such investigation by the court. In addition, the EU is open to further increasing its funding for the supply of weapons to Ukraine. The news comes as the 27-member bloc is drafting proposals for an EU oil embargo on Russia. While the momentum is growing within the region for fresh curbs on Russian fossil fuels, EU member states still remain split on an immediate blockade on Russian oil imports. Kim Yo-san, Arirang News.
President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol's inauguration ceremony on the 10th of May will also be open to members of the public. Our Yoon Jung-min has more on the list of invitees, as well as the Transition Committee's plans to adopt the universal standard of counting a person's age.
For President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol's inauguration on May 10th, there will be a chance for ordinary people to apply to attend. The Presidential Inaugural Ceremony Committee said Monday that a number of politicians and international diplomats will be invited as well. They're also going to see whether they get any messages from other countries wanting to send high-level delegations.
The purpose is to let the people know in detail the President-elect's determination to humbly serve the people and communicate with them honestly, as well as his philosophy of building a country where everyone's dreams can come true.
The slogan for the 20th Presidential Inaugural Ceremony has been translated as "Again Korea, New Country of the People." At the stroke of midnight on May 10th, there will be a bell-ringing ceremony at Poshingak Pavilion in central Seoul. As for whether the K-pop stars BTS will be invited, the Transition Committee has decided not to and has rejected claims that they were trying to use BTS for political purposes. It remains to be seen whether the ceremony will be attended by former President Park Geun-hye. President-elect Yoon, who is now on a tour of the southern region of the country, where Park now lives, is likely to offer an invitation when he meets her in Daegu on Tuesday. In the meantime, the Transition Committee announced on Monday a plan for South Korea to adopt the internationally recognized system for counting and reporting an individual's age. In common usage, people tend to report their so-called Korean age, where a baby is counted as having an age of 1 from the moment of birth, then adding a year on the first day of each new calendar year. But there's often confusion since Korea's legal system already mostly uses the international system, which adds years based on the date of birth.
The difference in calculating legal and social age has led to unnecessary social and economic costs in administrative services and when signing or interpreting various contracts.
They plan to first establish the unified system under the Civil Code and the General Act on Public Administration, and then gradually revise other laws using the international system. The transition team has emphasized the benefits of unifying the age counting system, saying it will minimize confusion for the public and make contracts and paperwork clearer. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Asia's economic prospects for this year are being overshadowed by geopolitical matters. The ASEAN Plus 3, including South Korea, Japan and China, will reportedly see an expansion of 4.7% in 2022, 1.2 percentage points lower than the growth seen in 2021. Now, this is according to the ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Organization on this Tuesday. The organization says the crisis in Ukraine has pushed up the cost of energy, food and essential raw materials. With regard to South Korea, the researchers within the organization believe the country will mark a 3% growth, 1 percentage point lower than last year, with inflation forecast to stand at 2.9%. Incheon International Airport ranked second in the world last year for international freight volume, moving up 1 spot from the year 2020. According to Airports Council International on Monday, freight volume via Incheon rose 18.6% on year in 2021 to over 3.2 million tons. Hong Kong International Airport topped the list, while Shanghai Pudong International Airport was third. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was the busiest in terms of passengers. 8 of the top 10 for passenger traffic were airports in the US. The data reportedly reveals an encouraging trend of recovery from the pandemic, as the number of global air passengers last year was up almost 25% compared to the previous year. On a light note now, young consumers are flocking to convenience stores for alcoholic beverages that reportedly come with a trendy twist. Arirang tells us more.
Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, with bars and restaurants closing early and caps on gatherings, more people in South Korea have been drinking alcohol at home. According to the Ministry of Health and Welfare, people drinking alone increased from 12.6% in 2019 to 29.2% in 2021. To gain more of a market share, South Korean convenience stores now have a wider selection of beverages, with craft beers now commonly available. Among them are the so-called music content beers, which are growing in popularity. The line of drinks was launched by a local craft beer brand in a partnership with a domestic hip-hop label. Each can has a QR code on it, and when scanned, customers' smartphones allow them to listen to music. Within just 2 weeks of release, all 200,000 cans were sold out.
I bought this beer because it seems trendy to me. I usually listen to music when drinking beer, and this product allows me to enjoy the music in an easier way.
There are also soft drinks that have movie characters on them, such as Batman and Superman.
We found that Generation MZs are likely to consume beverages with interesting pictures on them, instead of buying a product from an originally popular brand.
Wine sales at convenience stores are also steadily increasing. There are even limited edition collaborations with online games and bottles with artwork by Henri Matisse printed on them as part of a new trend of using wine bottles as interior decoration. As people in their 20s to 30s account for over 60% of convenience store customers in South Korea, more stores are seeking new ways to cater to their needs.
이래현, Arirang News.
Spring is in the air, they say, and we have the scenes to prove it. In fact, our Incheon was out and about to bring us this report.
You know it's spring in Korea when you see these flowers, cherry blossoms. I came to one of the most iconic cherry blossom roads in Korea, the Yoiseodo Road. And it's the first time in 3 years that it has opened during the blossoms for the public to enjoy. Due to the pandemic, local authorities have canceled cherry blossom festivals and prevented visitors from coming. But while the annual festival has been canceled for the third straight year, the 2-kilometer-long road is open for the weary public to forget about the pandemic and enjoy the springtime.
It feels different to look at these flowers here. They're much bigger and prettier than those in my own neighborhood.
I feel 10 years younger just by coming here. I think my excitement will last for over a year.
Yeah, I've never seen so many cherry trees in one place. And it's like an experience you can only have here. It's just amazing. You just keep looking and looking around you. And just keep walking and it keeps going.
To make sure visitors can safely enjoy cherry blossoms here, the local government is sticking to strict quarantine protocols. Staff members will be providing hand sanitizer and asking visitors to wear their masks at all times. Yoiseodo will also be a pedestrian-only road until April 17th. No cars, electric scooters, or even bicycles will be allowed from 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. on weekdays and from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. on weekends. Incheon, Arirang News.
Recent media response to Korea's COVID-19 strategy has been mixed, with some claiming the country may be among the first to usher in an endemic phase of COVID-19, that is, and others insisting challenges remain as caseloads have yet to subside. For more, I have freelance journalist Jack Barton here in the studio. It's a pleasure, Jack.
Pleasure to be here.
I also have Nicholas Roca at Radio France International.
Thanks
Nicholas,
for the
welcome.
invitation.
Right. Jack, we'll start with you then. So you've been covering the pandemic here and elsewhere for quite a while now. Before we start on that, though, out of a score of 10, what would you give Korea's COVID-19 strategy and why?
Well, we have to remember that it isn't over yet, and we're seeing different mutations. We're all hoping they're weaker mutations, but of course a stronger one could crop up. So we really need to wait another 5 or perhaps 10 years before we can give a good score. I'd say if South Korea, if it had only happened, if it was an epidemic that had only happened in South Korea, the handling would still be considered very good. There's no such thing as a perfect strategy or a perfect response, but I'd have to say it was an 8. But having travelled around and seen the way that other countries dealt with it, and then you look at the way Korea very quickly moved to, on the same day as receiving the genetic material from China, to start coming up with testing systems, churning out respirators at car factories, immediately coming up with strategies for intensive care units, improvised testing facilities, drive-through, mobile phone testing facilities, of course, track and tracing, all of this. Phenomenal. If you compare it to other countries, I'd have to say a 10 plus, a slightly higher than perfect score.
Right, thank you for your kind words then. Nicholas, how does Korea's present strategy then compare with its past?
I think we've seen a shift around February when President Moon Jae-in mentioned that we're changing and adapting to Omicron. So before there was a stress on limiting the number of cases as a whole, and then we shifted into a strategy that was focusing on limiting the deaths and the severe cases. So that meant the end of contact tracing as we have seen. And a shift to only focusing on hospital capacities, ICU beds being enough to welcome a patient. And I must say that shift has been pretty much efficient. There has been a few maybe hiccups. It took a bit of time in order to shift, which is perfectly understandable. I remember I had COVID at this moment and the health workers didn't really know what rules they should give me, but then we have seen it has been pretty efficient, and I think the fatality rate speaks for itself. South Korea is at 0.13%. It is very low compared to almost every other country in the world.
Right. There was quite a bit of talk, though, about our tracing efforts in the initial stages of our fight against the pandemic with regard to concerns over privacy. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I actually worked a lot on that because it's true there's been a bit of a fascination in Europe, at least, on, the private data of people being given to the government. And so I was able to follow contact tracers from Sochogu. And I was quite surprised to see it was, some almost police investigation work also that was done, really going to the location themselves. And I think when there was some explanation that was made about how it really worked, people that listened to or read the stories I've done, the feedbacks I had is that they were mostly surprised and that they felt the privacy was more respected than they actually believed.
Right. Jack, a number of foreign media outlets now say that Korea may serve as a model for learning to live with COVID-19. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think so, but most of the focus has been on how to get to that point. The media focus has been on how do you get to the point where you can live with COVID-19. So getting those vaccination rates really high, making sure all the facilities are there, that the hospitals aren't overloaded with people, and creating a stable condition. And I think that is there, and those few articles are right. What I would say is the great shame is that not enough countries have looked at South Korea's model and taken it on board. And throughout the pandemic, each country has tried to reinvent the wheel for itself without looking at other countries, particularly to East Asia and particularly to South Korea, for lessons learned. And if they do look elsewhere, it tends to be at countries that are doing worse than they are, so they can convince people, look, we're not doing too bad because look at this place, and not spending enough time looking at the systems that really worked. And I think that's one of the great shames. I think it's a lesson that still hasn't been learned. And, there isn't enough preparation out there in case this happens again.
And staying with the optimistic outlook then, Nicholas, what factors perhaps look to facilitate Korea's early transition, that is, hopefully, into an endemic phase of COVID-19?
When I first think that Korea was more ready, perhaps, than other countries to receive the initial waves of COVID-19, maybe because of the precedent of MERS. But the system was already in place. We had KCDC that was able to do, answers efficiently and quickly. I think also the efforts of the Korean population have to be stressed, even though there was a feeling of tiredness that we could feel when we talked to people. Korean people still seem to respect the basic rules, wearing the mask. We know it's maybe one of the most efficient ways to actually fight against the pandemic. And I think this is also partly because the Korean government has tried to continue to communicate throughout the pandemic to keep the people still focused. Of course, you mentioned also the high vaccination rate. That is definitely a key factor if you want to change to an endemic state of the pandemic.
Right, of course. Meanwhile, Jack, some say Korea's lifting of pandemic-related restrictions comes at an unlikely time, as caseloads currently still remain quite high. In fact, they believe that the ease in these measures may be more related to politics than health. What are your thoughts?
Well, that is something we've seen all around the world. Over the past 12 months, whenever a country is going into an election, we see restrictions being eased. There's something we're seeing everywhere. So there's no doubt that there is a political element to it. But as you just mentioned, caseloads down to 0.13%. That's sort of around in line with a strong seasonal flu. So it raises the question, if not now, when? There's no doubt a political element to it, but it's probably in line with the direction that everything should be going at the moment anyway, given that it has, from any way you look at it, entered an endemic phase. Again, we might get a stronger strain. It's not over yet. There could be surprises ahead. But as the situation currently stands, it would make sense, I would argue, the direction that politicians are going, even though, absolutely, there's no doubt that the recent election and the upcoming change in government is playing into what's happening.
Right, and on the same wavelength, Nicholas, there are some health experts who claim that economic concerns are being placed ahead of epidemiological risks. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if you compare it to European countries, I think that in Korea we cannot say this because, we have kept some restriction that still put economic barriers for, small store owners, coffee owners, small business owners as a whole. I think there has been a lot of pressure on them. And And I think we just cannot say this. In a way, what maybe is hard to do is to try to balance it. And that's what I think the Korean government tried to do, to balance the economic life that is necessary and the epidemiological risk. So I would not agree that the Korean government has done it only for economic concerns.
Right. Nicholas, are there any aspects of Korea's COVID-19 strategy, perhaps that may have been enhanced, that is, to allow for a better response mechanism?
In retrospect, there are probably always some systems that could have been enhanced, but that's beyond the incredible level that they were already at. So if we look at track and trace treatment, if we look at the hospital response, if we look at all of it, these were immense. It went far beyond what most countries did. And then if we look at some of the earlier steps where we thought at the time, well, maybe that's the wrong step, like not closing arrivals from China. And a lot of people thought maybe the government got that right, but it turned out that it really didn't make much of a difference. Countries that did close those routes, well, it just came in via somewhere else. And so Moon followed World Health Organization recommendations, which was to not block arrivals from countries, and until late last year also followed WHO rules on mandates. The WHO saying there's no evidence they really work because, of course, even though we know that the harm done to people is reduced by vaccines, transmission doesn't seem to be greatly affected. So perhaps that was a government misstep, complicating matters for small business further when it had already been shown that that probably wasn't a great idea. But overall, I would really argue that the government went above and beyond what so many other governments did. And I don't want to sound like, a massive fan of the Moon government. Sure, I've got plenty of criticism for other policies like the real estate policy, which probably lost the government the election. But on this one, I really think the government got it right. And one of the ways they got it right was just once they decided to act, going all out. I mean, putting every effort into it, particularly when it came to cooperation between government ministries and the health department. That's also something we really didn't see elsewhere. Was that incredible effort of coordination between the various departments, without which I don't think they could have achieved the success that they did.
Oh, I see. And staying with that, Jack, are there any other aspects of then perhaps of Korea's strategy that could be learned by other countries?
One is just to be prepared. You mentioned the MERS earlier, the fact that South Korea did get that so wrong and learned from those lessons back in 2015, I think it was, setting up roughly 150 laboratories across the country that were ready. If something popped up, they could basically work on what they had, and those laboratories could just set to task immediately. The fact that they had a kind of a medical response emergency plan in place, the fact that the big car manufacturers could retool up so quickly to start pumping out respirators. Just this pre-preparation, having a plan and following through. And the other one, and this is a little bit controversial, I would say, not abdicating political responsibility. So many other governments around the world just step back and essentially let health officials take over the running of the country, including the economy and everything else. And the South Korean government didn't do that. It came under enormous pressure at home, again, to stop arrivals from China. And Moon said, this isn't in line with basic rights, it's not what the WHO is saying, and pushed ahead. So I think, that's it, having a big plan in place and not absolving yourself of responsibility in as a crisis and just pushing the responsibility over to somebody else. They kept that leadership role, and I think that was really critical to the calm manner in which we're seeing it with Zelensky in Ukraine. Good leadership, there's just no substitute for it.
Right. Well, they do say that prevention is better than cure, so preparation is really important then. Nicholas, like Jack mentioned, unlike a number of its counterparts, Korea was able to avoid a complete lockdown to contain COVID-19, that is. Do you suppose this reality in itself is perhaps a clear proof of both the government's and the public's active campaign against COVID-19?
Well, it's undeniably a success, because if you compare to other models, in a way, you had either Europe or the US that had some lockdowns at some point, but still had the tremendous number of deaths, and now have maybe a bit more relieved economic life and is going towards with almost no restriction. On the other hand, what are the other options? I mean, you have China, and even though the number of deaths is pretty low, the situation we're seeing in Shanghai is not unviable either. So I think South Korea arrived to kind of a balanced answer and managed to keep the numbers of cases low until a moment it was ready to have a higher number of caseloads and just adapt in order to prevent its people from dying. That being said, I think if you mention that Korea has been a success, it has definitely been, and foreign medias have been underlying it, I think there has still been a few problems, and there has been a few things that were not really well perceived, I think, for medias, international medias. And there has been two moments maybe that I keep in mind, and it's the mass testing of foreign workers in Gyeonggi province that did maybe not a lot of sense scientifically speaking, and that maybe hurt a bit the international image of Korea that was definitely defined as a model. And on the other hand, also the fact that the vaccine recognition were not allowed to, for foreigners vaccinated abroad for a while. And I mean, those little two, it appears as maybe symbolic or not very important, but I think it hurt a bit the image of South Korea that was throughout the pandemic almost always considered as a model.
And staying with that, Nicholas, do you believe the actions that came after those unfortunate events served to perhaps ease the impact on Korea's image?
Well, I think it definitely did, but the problem is that it came only after there was a lot of publication of different medias. I mean, it appeared a bit like a reaction, and I think there has been an understanding afterwards from the Korean government that those measures were not really scientifically useful and were just, I mean, it's hard to understand why they occurred in the first place because they had no scientific value and it hurted the image. But I think maybe, perhaps the good thing is that the Korean government understood that on the international scene, they really benefited from their, we're just saying, the very efficient way they handle COVID. So, I mean, in a way, it didn't make sense to hurt this global image with those little mistakes. Probably it's been understood by the current administration.
Right. And staying with that, Jack, some local commentary regarding the government strategy claim authorities are rushing into efforts to usher in an endemic phase given our pali-pali culture. I'm sure you'll understand that. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think South Korea was very pali-pali when it came to the right things. So, you know, rushing into the response. But on some things, it's been quite slow. It's had a bit of a chonchony response. Vaccines, but for the right reasons. They wanted to look around and said this, you know, we want to look around and make sure they're safe, see which are the best ones, and then procure the ones that we feel are the most suitable. And I think that was a good policy because they had the breathing space to do it. The tracing was keeping the numbers very low at the time, proved to be a successful policy. And I think now they're going quite slowly. I mean, I've travelled to a lot of places over the last 6 months. I remember late last year seeing in Indianapolis in a packed blues bar with the band playing, no masks on, drinks, and thinking, was there ever a pandemic? Even in Australia, which went through an almost North Korean-like lockdown when I was there at the start of the year, again, walking around, no masks, everything was almost back to normal again. So South Korea has actually probably been a little bit slow in returning to living with COVID compared to most other countries. And perhaps that's not such a bad thing, you know, moving a little bit. It's been cautious, fast in the right areas, cautious in the right areas as well.
Right. And Nicholas, what do you suppose are some lessons perhaps that other countries, including France maybe, that could learn from Korea with regard to COVID-19 containment?
Well, there's a couple of them. And first of all, I mean, Jack mentioned the fact that maybe some Western countries had to be more humble and watch what other countries have been doing right, which, if I take the example of France, didn't. I think maybe one big lesson that hasn't been stressed enough is that communication is key if you want to keep the population on board. And since the beginning of the pandemic, there has been constant communication, twice a day press conference by KCDC, by the Korean government. I have covered a bit for my part the beginning of the pandemic in France. And I mean, noticing the difference between the two has been, it's a radical difference. I mean, in France, we struggled to have answers from the government. We have had a spokesperson of the government saying that masks were useless. I mean, it's the opposite that what we've seen in Korea. And I think that helped to keep the population on board for 2 years. Other than that, I think the fact that Korea continued with testing throughout the pandemic, I mean, some countries maybe eased eased the testing once we were with the Omicron variant and the numbers were so high and the caseload were so high. Korea continued, and that allowed the country to be able to detect which cases were severe or not and keep this death rate so low. So I think this would be two lessons, and also, of course, being prepared, as Jack also mentioned before.
Right. And Jack, Korea is hoping to emerge as a vaccine hub in the near future. It has a plan for that, but India has been known to be making vaccines for quite a long time now. What are Korea's prospects of emerging as a vaccine hub here in this particular region?
Well, I think Korea's prospects are very, very good. We've seen whenever Korea sets its mind to something, it tends to throw a lot of government support behind it. There's a lot of coordinated effort. And one of the good things about Korea is the fact that you have very large companies. That's also a bad thing because they often suppress small to medium companies that struggle, leading to a two-track economy. But if you could say there's a positive side to that two-track economy, it is when it comes to something that comes to a big export potential product with big companies getting on board, it will happen. I'm sure India will also succeed in this area as well, because India just has such a strong track record in this area. But yeah, look, given South Korea's capabilities, particularly in this area of bioscience and, you know, more than 30% of GDP is export driven. That's one of the biggest in the world, if not the biggest in the world, probably just behind Germany. No doubt, I think this is going to succeed.
Right. And Nicholas, you mentioned the hardships faced by some of our small and mid-sized firms amid the social restrictions imposed by the government to contain COVID-19. Do you suppose the efforts being made right now to address those problems with regard to livelihoods are working?
I think small business owners are maybe a bit relieved to see that there has been an understanding of the government. I mean, we've seen media reports and that the government was trying to discuss with them to find other options. I mean, that being said, it might take some time for them to recover from those 2 years of pandemic, even though the government tried to do relief plans, loans at lower rates. I mean, we've seen a number of shops closing. So I think the government definitely understood that, I mean, the stress was put on them, but it was, in a way, a political choice to put it on small business owners. And even though they acknowledged it, I think there will still be a lot of efforts that have to be made by the next administration in order to maybe make all those small stores owner to put them in a better economic situation.
And for the sake of comparison, Nicholas, what can you tell us about the impact, such economic impacts on businesses over in France amid the lockdown or the social restrictions?
I mean, there has been, it was different because, you know, we had 3 months lockdowns, for instance, or 2 months and a half, with no activities for anybody, but the government continued to pay salaries to people. I mean, it was a bit different because it was not relief plans with a one-time check. It was a monthly wage that was still given, which cost the government a tremendous amount of money, of course, but that still managed to keep those restaurant owners or coffee owners into a position that they could open. There's also structural differences between the two countries. It's less important in France, those small business owners. We have, I mean, it's less important if you look at the overall economy. So yeah, I think that was two different answers. It's hard to tell which one is the best. I think we're going to see this in the long term.
Right. Now, Jack, you mentioned a potential decade-long life with COVID-19. It might be for 5 years or 10 years, like you said at the start. Keeping that in mind, we have vaccinations for children approved, those aged 5 to 11. But some people claim that the government perhaps is not doing enough to encourage the vaccine uptake among the children here in the country. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is such a thorny issue, and whatever opinion you have on it, it's sort of dangerous. Someone's going to come at you. What we saw is with the previous strains that were stronger for adults actually seemed to be much milder for children, and now Omicron actually is having an impact on children. But we're still seeing vaccines that wear off very quickly, that still need booster shots quite regularly, and as the variants change, so does the impact. And then you've got another argument coming out now also, you know, from a sizable level of the medical community saying if we keep changing the vaccines to suit, now that we have a weak strain, maybe we should let it run for a little bit. Now, I'm not saying that's the case. I'm not a health official, just looking at what's being reported and what people are talking about. I think this is an area that we really can't judge for a few years to come, and the debate is still ongoing about even whether adults should be receiving extra boosters of a vaccine that actually isn't suitable for Omicron or the new variants that are emerging. What's that doing to create further mutations? And I normally have an opinion on most things, but I'm almost too scared to wade in on this one because it is such a thorny, contentious issue at the moment. But I would definitely say that's not a given, that children should be getting vaccinations that are from older strains, and I think that debate's still ongoing.
Right, actually, and health expert actually did say that there are more questions than answers with regard to vaccinations at this particular point. All right, Jack, thank you very much for your insights today, and Nicholas, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. Pakistan has a new prime minister following the ousting of the country's previous leader, Imran Khan. Following a no-confidence vote over the weekend, Khan was replaced by Shehbaz Sharif, who was sworn in yesterday. His appointment comes after he won support from 174 lawmakers in Pakistan's 342-member parliament during a vote to elect a new leader. However, the new appointment has been met with backlash as 100 legislators loyal to Khan resigned yesterday, potentially hindering Sharif's efforts to carry the country through its current political and economic crisis. The 23rd Prime Minister will now assemble a new government until the next general elections in August 2023. A new rule to curb ghost guns and prohibit their manufacture was announced by US President Joe Biden yesterday, amid growing pressure to clamp down on gun-related deaths and violent crime in the nation. The measure was finalized by the Department of Justice after more than a year-long federal regulation process and forms part of a series of gun measures outlined by the Biden administration. Ghost guns are privately made weapons not marked by a serial number, making them almost untraceable for authorities investigating gun crime. The ban includes so-called buy, build, shoot kits, which can be bought online without a background check and can be assembled in under 30 minutes. Statistics show that in 2021, 20,000 suspected ghost guns were reported, 10 times more than in 2016. Meanwhile, gun-related deaths in 2021 came to 20,726, with 693 mass shootings recorded. Lunar dust gathered by the first man on the moon, Neil Armstrong, during the famous Apollo 11 mission is set to go under the hammer sometime in mid-April. Estimates by the auction company in charge have placed its value at between $800,000 to $1.2 million US, as it's the only known sample that can be sold legally. However, the lunar sample has created some friction between its owner and NASA. The owner bought the moon dust at an Illinois auction in 2015 for $995 before asking the space agency to verify its origins. Upon realizing the nature of the sample, NASA refused to return it, but was given a court order to do so. Tests ahead of the upcoming auction have also verified its authenticity. Twitter's CEO announced yesterday that Elon Musk will not be joining the company's board. Saying only that Musk had turned down the role, the head of the social media platform noted that there may be more drama and distractions ahead. Now, this comes as an appointment for the Tesla billionaire was set to take place on Saturday, which would have prevented him from owning more than 14.9% of Twitter's common stock. He has since uploaded a tweet in response with an emoji depicting shock by covering its mouth with its hand. The updates follow Musk's purchase of a 9.1% stake in Twitter and a disclosure regarding plans to bring about changes to the platform. He also ran a Twitter poll before taking a stake, asking users whether they believe Twitter adheres to free speech principles. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
I think sometimes if
Good Tuesday afternoon. We are not even halfway through April, but it feels like summer is just around the corner. I mean, central and northern areas aside, where there'll be some rain in the late afternoon. Scattered showers are expected in Gyeonggi-do and northern Gangwon-do provinces later today, with gusts of wind and even some thunder. Street furniture might be flying around, so please be careful and stay safe if you're out and about. The rain won't be much heavy, only about 5 to 10 millimeters in many areas. But that's enough to get you wet, so I hope you brought your brollies with you this morning. And if not, you might want to buy one before your commute home. And temperature-wise, the high in Seoul dips down to 21 compared to yesterday, and Daegu hitting 30 and Gyeongju hitting 31. With some spring rain falling tomorrow and Thursday across the country, temperatures will go back to the normal for April. And now I'll send it back to you with the worldwide weather conditions.
And that is all from us at this hour. Do stay tuned to Arirang News for more coverage. Thank you for now.